So for this video, rather than describing the work that I'm executing and what you guys are watching, because, let's be honest, it's a video of watching paint dry, I thought I would take the chance to address some of the questions that kept popping up in the comments section and give you a little bit of backstory on the painting, how it came to be in my studio, my conversations with my client, my decisions on what I was and wasn't going to do, and a couple of larger questions related to retouching in general. So my client had owned this painting for quite some time, and at one point in the past had taken it to another conservator for a comprehensive conservation and restoration. Unfortunately, that relationship soured after some breakdown in communication, a timeline that wasn't met, and ultimately unsatisfactory work. My client pulled the painting back from the conservator and sat on it for a while until they found me. My client contacted me and asked me to take a look at the painting and see if there was anything that I thought could be done to return it to some state where they could enjoy the painting and not just the damage. My client tried to explain to me what had happened to the painting, and as best I could deduce, it really was just a failure of communication, not being clear about expectations, timelines, or what was going to be delivered. And that's pretty basic stuff. That's kind of business 101. Being clear and open with your client is really important so that everybody knows what's going to be expected of every party and what the final outcomes are going to be. My client did include a packet of information that had all of the correspondence between them and the previous conservator, and not much of it was very helpful in determining what work had been done. Again, it was really just documenting the breakdown of the relationship. I tried to contact the other conservator to find out what work was done and to get their opinion on the work itself, and I was unsuccessful. I don't really know what was done to the painting or what wasn't done to the painting, and to some degree, that information, while novel, is kind of moot because I have to address the painting as it lands in my studio, and crying over spilt milk or lamenting previous techniques doesn't really serve a purpose. Now, my client told me what to expect when I opened the box, but when the painting arrived at the studio and I actually saw the painting, I was a little surprised at just how damaged it was. As you can see, it's in a pretty rough state. There's a lot of paint loss. There were some heavy-handed cleanings executed on the painting before, and that resulted in a skinning of the paint layer. And that's where the top layer of the paint is abraded to the point of being removed, and that's why you see all those little black dots and odd shapes. That's kind of the underpainting that's showing through. In addition, there was a ton of old overpaint that had been done in oil paint. And the scope of my work on this project was going to be limited to just the retouching. I wasn't really interested in digging deeper into this painting and taking it apart anymore, and neither was my client. They really just wanted the image put back together, and I was fine because I didn't really feel like I wanted to open up this can of worms any further than it had already been opened. So the scope of my work was, again, just limited to putting the painting back together. And as I mentioned, I had quite a bit of correspondence with my client before I even drafted any proposals, and that consisted of many hours of phone calls and tons of emails back and forth. And while that takes up a lot of time, it's absolutely critical for any project, particularly one with the baggage that this one had. It's important because I need to know what my client expects out of the project, what they expect out of me, and what they expect out of the painting. It's also important that my client knows what I can deliver, what I'm comfortable with doing, and what I see the final result of success being. So going back and forth and talking a lot allowed me to really hone in on what my client wanted out of this project. And they weren't really interested in unearthing any more bad conservation or tearing the painting apart and rebuilding it from the ground up. They were really focused on putting the image back together so that they could enjoy the painting. enjoy what the artist intended, and enjoy the story, the narrative, and not to see the painting as part of a painting, or a heavily damaged painting, or bits and pieces of a painting. And so, understanding that, I was able to focus in on what I was going to do to the painting to meet that need. Now, this painting had a ton of retouching, and that's pretty clear when you see the painting. But understanding just how far I was going to go with the retouching and what approach I was going to take was also pretty necessary. And that's again where I communicated with my client. There are tons of different approaches for retouching a painting with this much loss. Everything from really just leaving the damage as is, to slightly toning it, to camouflaging it, to integrating some of the most important aspects of the scene, like the face or the hands, to integrating most of the scene, to fully integrating all of the scene. And each one of those is a valid approach to conservation and retouching in particular. It really just depends on what the conservator wants and needs, what the painting wants and needs, and ultimately what the client wants and needs. And because I'm in private practice, many of the decisions that I make are guided and driven by what my clients want and need. For conservators that work in museums or work on private collections or historical societies, they may take a different approach, and that's totally okay because they have a different set of parameters in which they're working. But for me, I have to serve my clients, and so while I certainly won't do anything that I feel is unethical or inappropriate, my clients have a lot of leeway in their demands, and I can encourage them one way or the other based on what I think is going to deliver the best result, but ultimately I have to meet their wishes to some degree. I can try to talk them down, or I can hedge, but they are the client. They are the ones that own the painting and brought the painting to me, and so I need to do my best to meet their expectations. And with this client, it was pretty clear after we communicated that while it wasn't going to be possible to fully remove all of the damage and all of the wear and tear on the painting, because after all, this painting is nearly 400 years old, it was important for the client that the painting be put back together as much as possible so that the painting could be viewed as a whole image. And so again, after a lot of discussion, we settled on a fairly extensive retouching process whereby I was going to address as much of the damage as I could. And I explained to my client that one of the ways that I determine whether or not something gets retouched, if they haven't given me explicit instructions, is to take my cues from the painting. And one way I do that is by looking at the size and the scale of the painting. Now, this painting was pretty small, maybe 20 inches by 14 inches or so. And so it's going to be viewed from about 2.5, maybe 3 feet away, possibly even closer. And so when I do the retouching, I situate myself at about that distance, and anything that I see that breaks up the image or becomes visually problematic is a candidate for retouching. And then I'll evaluate that and decide how much retouching to do on that, or whether or not we can get away with leaving that one or two things like that. If this painting were much larger, let's say 15 feet by 20 feet, I might not retouch some of the very, very small bits of damage, because you're not going to be viewing the painting from that close, and so your eye won't necessarily catch those little pieces of damage. Again, with different styles of painting, the approach also may be different. With an abstract expressionist painting, there is a ton of leeway. I have seen paintings with tears that the client didn't even know were present because the painting is so visually busy. However, with a minimalist painting, every little imperfection shows, and so there's much less margin of error for damage or other visual intrusions. So armed with a history of the painting and a pretty good understanding of what my client expected and wanted out of this conservation, the work could begin. Now, I mentioned that I wasn't going to be doing an extensive cleaning on this painting, partially because it had already been cleaned, and really cleaned at that, but I still did a light surface cleaning just to make sure that there was no dust or dirt or any other particulate matter that had settled on the painting. Then the next step for me was applying an isolation layer, and that's a ultraviolet stable synthetic resin layer that goes down atop the painting that will separate my retouching from the original work. And there are a couple of reasons that I do that. One, even though the paints that I retouch with are reversible, putting down an isolation layer that is also reversible ensures that the next conservator who works on this painting is going to have a much easier time removing my work than I would have had if I tried to remove the oil paint that was on this painting. And additionally, the isolation layer allows me to see the paints as they will look when they're finally varnished. Now, that is to say that in its current state, before the isolation layer goes on, the painting looks pretty washed out. The colors are dry, they're drab, you can't get much definition, and if I were to retouch against those colors, when I apply the final varnish, my retouching wouldn't match the original paints. And so the isolation layer simulates what the painting will look like when it's finally varnished, and then I can retouch against that. Now, my retouching paints will dry slightly lighter than when they're finally varnished, and so it's something that I have to keep in mind, that when I go back in to rework on an area that I have previously worked on, I have to remember that what I'm seeing isn't necessarily what it's going to look like in the final outcome. And I know that's kind of confusing to think about, but if you do it enough, you can kind of train your eye and your brain to work around that problem. Anyhow, with the isolation layer applied, I could begin the retouching process. So the actual mixing and applying of the paints to the painting is one that's not terribly difficult. It's basic color matching, and it's a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of little dots. And as you can see, I'm just trying to work through and put a little dot of color where I see missing paint so that your eye will kind of naturally assume that to be the way the painting looked. Now, what I mean by that is if we zoomed in on this painting down to 10 or 100 times magnification, there's a pretty good chance that my retouching will not match perfectly the original paints. And that's because I'm not a computer. I'm not one of those paint mixing programs at the hardware store. And depending on the light that I retouch in and the light that the painting is viewed in, those colors may shift a little bit. But what we're really trying to do is to disguise the damage as much as possible so that our eyes can pass over the damage and our brains can fill it in as always being a unified part of the painting. That is, if we see a big gaping black spot on the arm, we see that spot, we identify it as damage, and it breaks the continuity of the image. But if we see an area that's camouflaged, even though upon very close inspection we may be able to detect that there's retouching there, if we look at the image as a whole, our eyes will allow us to pass those areas and our brains will fill them in. So it's a question of seeing the forest for the trees. Of course, if you really comb over a painting with a magnifying glass and a very critical eye, you can always spot the damage. That's kind of a universal truth. But if you take a step back and you look at the painting as a whole, are you able to see the image and not the damage? That's kind of where we're aiming at, particularly for a painting with this much damage. And so it's a matter of working slowly and adding a little bit of paint and taking a step back, and then adding a little bit of paint and taking a step back and assessing how the work is coming. So for a project with this much retouching, I have to find ways to keep myself both intellectually and emotionally invested and not exhausted. And a good analogy is that you don't run a marathon 26.2 miles. You run 1 mile 26.2 times. It may sound hackneyed and corny, but trust me, if you ever run a marathon, it makes a lot of sense. So I will take this painting piece by piece. I'll work on one part, then I'll take a day off, or I will step away from it, and then I'll work on another part, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways I keep myself engaged and focused is by leaving the face to the end. Partially because if I leave it to the end, I've had a lot more experience working with the palette, and I'm that much better, that much more refined and tuned to this artist's palette, so it gives me a higher chance of success retouching the face. And of course, that's the thing that everybody's going to look at. But also, it's really one of the more exciting things to do, is to retouch the face of a cherub that was painted 400 years ago, and to see it slowly come together, and to see the cherub's cheeks flesh out and get, chunky, and to see the lips and the mouth come together, and in this case, to see the eye come back together. Even though I don't know exactly what it looked like, I can take my cues from other paintings by the artist, similar works by his contemporaries, and cues from the painting itself, the other eye. And so keeping the face to the end is one way that I can maintain a high degree of excitement. Now, another thing that everyone was very curious about was whether or not I was going to be signing this painting and treating it as a collaboration with the artist. And the answer, of course, is no, I'm not the artist, and there'd be no way that I would ever sign a painting that I worked on. That's totally inappropriate. And I know that you all were joking, but I think what you were asking about is that when a painting has this much loss, at what point does it become recreation rather than merely conservation? And that's a really good question. And unfortunately, there's no clear line. There's not really any answer that says, well, at this point, at 22% retouching, it's now not original, or at 48% retouching, it is now more the conservator's work. And this is something that conservators all over the world for the history of conservation have been dealing with on paintings small and large, minor and grand. In fact, the recent conservation of the purportedly newly discovered painting by Leonardo da Vinci, the Salvator Mundi, came under a lot of criticism for the extensive amount of retouching that the conservator did. And if you've seen the painting before the conservation, it was beat up. It was a sad state. It was really a lousy looking painting with a ton of damage. It had been terribly overcleaned, poorly conserved in the past, and when the most recent conservator got the painting to a nude or a raw state as close to the artist's original intent, reversing all of the old work, they were faced with the reality that this painting needed a ton of retouching. And while I don't think that the conservator would say that they were a collaborator or that they were as talented or skilled as Leonardo, they're doing their best job to try to put the painting back together with the best information available, such that the painting would be in a state that met the client's expectations. And for that painting, it needed to be auction ready and presentable to potential buyers who were going to be spending $500 million on the painting. Now, my painting had a little bit lower level of stakes, but I still needed to deliver my painting to my client in a state that would meet their expectations and that would allow them to feel happy with the work that I had done and with the conservation process writ large. Now, my client may own the painting for 1 year, 5 years, 50 years, 70 years, but at some point, this painting is going to be passed on to a new owner. And at that point, if that owner decides that the approach that me and my client took isn't to their liking and they want to take a different approach, that's perfectly fine. They own the painting. They can do with it as they please. They can remove my work, and they can remove it because I've been using reversible paints and an isolation layer of synthetic resin. And so the next conservator can look at my work under a blacklight, see where I've added paint, and look at my report, see what materials I've used, and easily reverse it without running risk of damage to the painting. And so, because everything is archival and reversible, I'm kind of the opinion that there isn't necessarily a wrong way to go about retouching this painting. I certainly wouldn't put a mustache on the baby or cover the cherub up with a cloak, because that's really too much work. But in the case of this painting, where the foot was missing, my client made it pretty clear that they wanted that foot recreated and that it wouldn't be okay to just leave it as a stump or kind of a disintegrated suggestion of a foot. The next client may say, well, Baumgartner was way too invasive in assuming what the foot looked like. Or, well, that foot doesn't even look good. It looks kind of sloppy. Or, well, we know that cherubs don't have 5 toes, they have 6 toes. Whatever. They can take a different approach, and because I've taken care to make sure that nothing I'm doing is permanent, they can undo my work very easily, and then they can have their conservator do what they wish. And hopefully their conservator will take the same care and precautions. In fact, hopefully in the future they'll have better materials and better approaches, and the cycle continues. And this is one thing that we have to keep in mind, that we only own artwork for a small period during its life. And different owners have different tastes. They have different approaches to conservation, and conservators have different tools and techniques, and over time, different methodologies and different approaches to conservation as a whole. And so what we do today may be looked back upon as archaic, but if we're using reversible materials and we're taking care to document it, the stakes are very, very low, and we've made sure that nothing we're doing is permanent or potentially harmful. Anyhow, I hope that this has cleared up some of the questions that you guys have posted. I really do enjoy seeing them in the comments and seeing what's on your mind and what you guys are curious about. I try to do my best answering them, but this is a little bit easier than typing out a bajillion answers to the same question. So I hope it's addressed some of those questions. I'm sure you guys have tons more, and I will continue to look at the comments and try to provide insights as I can. Anyhow, thanks for watching. As always, stay tuned. I'll have more videos coming up shortly.